Chapter 4 The Way of Devotion. Bhakti in itself is as wide as the heart yearning of the soul of the divine for the divine, and as simple and straightforward as love and desire going straight towards their object. It cannot therefore be fixed down to any systematic method, cannot found itself on a psychological science, like Raja Yoga, or a psychophysical, like the Hatha Yoga, or start from a definitive intellectual process like the ordinary method of jnana yoga. It may employ various means or supports, and man, having in him a tendency towards order, process, and system, may try to methodize his resort to these auxiliaries, but to give an account of their variations one would have to review almost all man's numberless religions upon their side of inner approach to the deity. Really, however, the more intimate yoga of bhakti resolves itself simply into these four movements: the desire of the soul when it turns towards God, and the straining of its emotion towards him, the pain of love, and the divine return of love, the delight of love possessed, and the play of that delight, and the eternal enjoyment of the divine lover, which is the heart of celestial bliss. These are things that are at once too simple and too profound for methodizing and for analysis. One can at best only say, here are these four successive elements, steps, if we may so call them, of the siddhi. And here are, largely, some of the means which it uses, and here again are some of the aspects and experiences of the sadhana of devotion. We need only trace broadly the general line they follow before we turn to consider how the way of devotion enters into synthetic and integral yoga, what place it takes there, and how its principles affect the other principles of divine living. All yoga is a turning of the human mind and human soul, not yet divine in realization, but feeling the divine impulse and attraction in it towards that by which it finds its greater being. Emotionally, the first form which this turning takes must be that of adoration. In ordinary religion, this adoration wears the form of external worship, and that again develops a most external form of ceremonial worship. This element is ordinarily necessary because the mass of men live in their physical minds, cannot realize anything except by the force of a physical symbol, and cannot feel that they are living anything except by the force of physical action. We might apply here the tantric gradation of sadhana, which makes the way of the pasu, the herd, the animal or physical being, the lowest stage of its discipline, and say that the purely or predominantly ceremonial adoration is the first step of this lower part of the way. It is evident that even real religion, and yoga is something more than religion, only begins when this quite outward worship corresponds to something that really felt within the mind, some genuine submission, awe, or spiritual aspiration, to which it becomes an aid, an outward expression, and also a sort of periodical or constant reminder, helping draw back the mind to it from the preoccupations of ordinary life. But so long as it is only an idea of the Godhead to which one renders reverence or homage, we have not yet got to the beginning of yoga. The aim of yoga being union, its beginning must always be a seeking after the divine, a longing after some kind of touch, closeness, or possession. When this comes on us, the adoration becomes always primarily an inner worship. We begin to make ourselves a temple of the divine, our thoughts and feelings a constant prayer of aspiration and seeking, our whole life an external service and worship. It is as this change, this new soul tendency grows, that the religion of the devotee becomes a yoga, a growing contact and union. It does not follow that the outward worship will necessarily be dispensed with, but it will increasingly become only a physical expression or outflowing of the inner devotion and adoration, the wave of the soul throwing itself out in speech and symbolic act. Adoration, before it turns into an element of the deeper yoga of devotion, a petal of the flower of love, its homage and self-uplifting to its son, must bring with it, if it is profound, an increasing consecration of the being to the divine who is adored. And one element of this consecration must be a self-purifying, so as to become fit for the divine contact, or for the entrance of the divine into the temple of our being, or for his self-revelation in the shrine of the heart. This purifying may be ethical in its character, but it will not be merely the moralist seeking for the right and blameless action, or even, once we reach the state of yoga, an obedience to the law of God as revealed in formal religion. But it will be a throwing away, catharsis, of all that conflicts, whether with the idea of the divine in himself or of the divine in ourselves. In the former case, it becomes an habit of feeling an outer act in imitation of the divine. In the latter, a growing into his likeness in our nature. What inner adoration is to ceremonial worship, this growing into the divine likeness is to the outward ethical life. It culminates in a sort of liberation by likeness to the divine, a liberation from our lower nature, and a change into the divine nature. Consecration becomes in its fullness a devoting of all our being to the divine, therefore also of all our thoughts and all our works. Here the yoga takes into itself the essential elements of the yoga of works and the yoga of knowledge, but in its own manner and with its own particular spirit. It is a sacrifice of life and works to the divine, but a sacrifice of love, more than a turning of the will to the divine will. The Bhakta offers up his life, and all that he is, and all that he has, and all that he does to the divine. This surrender may take the ascetic form, as when he leaves the ordinary life of men and devotes his days solely to prayer and praise and worship, or to ecstatic meditation, gives up his personal possessions and becomes a monk, or the mendicant whose one and only possession is the divine, gives up all actions in life except those only which help or belong to the communion with the divine, and communion with other devotees, or at most keeps the doing from the secure fortress of the ascetic life of those services to men which seem particularly the outflowing of the divine nature of love, compassion, and good. But there is the wider self-consecration, proper to any integral yoga, which, accepting the fullness of life and the world in its entirety as the play of the divine, offers up the whole being into his possession. It is a holding of all one is and has as belonging to him only, and not to ourselves, and a doing of all works as an offering to him. By this comes the complete act of consecration of both the inner and the outer life, the unmutilated self-giving. There is also the consecration of the thoughts to the divine. In its inception, this is an attempt to fix the mind on the object of adoration, for naturally, the restless human mind is occupied with other objects, and even when it is directed upwards, constantly drawn away from the world, so that in the end it habitually thinks of him and all else as only secondary and thought of only in relation to him. This is done often with the aid of a physical image, or more intimately and characteristically of a mantra or a divine name through which the divine being is realized. There are supposed by those who systematize to be 3 stages of the seeking through the devotion of the mind. First, the constant hearing of the divine name, qualities, and all that has been attached to them. Secondly, the constant thinking on them, or the divine being or personality. Thirdly, the settling and fixing of the mind on the object, and by this comes the full realization. And by these two, there comes, when the accompanying feeling or the concentration is very intense, the samadhi, the ecstatic trance in which the consciousness passes away from outer objects. But all this is really incidental. The one thing essential is the intense devotion of the thought and the mind to the object of adoration. Although it seems akin to the contemplation of the way of knowledge, it differs from that in its spirit. It is in its real nature not a still, but an ecstatic contemplation. It seeks not to pass into the being of the divine, but to bring the divine into ourselves and to lose ourselves in the deep ecstasy of his presence or of his possession. And its bliss is not the peace of unity, but the ecstasy of union. Here too, there may be the separate self-consecration which ends in the giving up of all other thought of life for the possession of this ecstasy, eternal afterwards in planes beyond, or the comprehensive consecration in which all the thoughts are full of the divine, and even in the occupations of life, every thought remembers him. As in the other yogas, so in this, one comes to see the divine everywhere, and in all, and to pour out the realization of the divine in all one's inner activities and outward actions. But all is supported here by the primary force of the emotional union, for it is by love that the entire self-consecration and the entire possession is accomplished, and thought and action becomes shapes and figures of the divine love, which possesses the spirit and its members. This is the ordinary movement by which what may be at first a vague adoration of some idea of the divine takes on the hue and character, and then, once entered into the path of yoga, the inner reality and intense experience of divine love. But there is the more intimate yoga, which from the first consists in this love and attains only by the intensity of its longing, without other process or method. All the rest comes, but it comes out of this. As a leaf and flower out of the seed, other things are not the means of developing and fulfilling love, but the radiations of love already growing in the soul. This is the way that the soul follows when, while occupied perhaps with the normal human life, it has heard the flute of the Godhead behind the near screen of the secret woodlands, and no longer possesses itself, can have no satisfaction or rest till it has pursued and seized and possessed the divine flute player. This is, in essence, the power of love itself in the heart and soul, turning from earthly objects to the spiritual source of all beauty and delight. There live in this seeking all the sentiment and passion, all the moods and experiences of love, concentrated on a supreme object of desire and intensified 100-fold beyond the highest acme of intensity possible to a human love. There is the disturbance of the whole life, the illumination by an unseized vision, and the unsatisfied yearning for a single object of the heart's desire. The intense impatience of all that distracts from one preoccupation, the intense pain of the obstacles that stand in the way of possession, the perfect vision of all beauty and delight in a single form. And there are all the many moods of love, the joy of musing and absorption, the delight of the meeting and fulfillment and embrace, the pain of separation, the wrath of love, the tears of longing, the increased delight of reunion. The heart is the scene of the supreme idol of the inner consciousness, but a heart which undergoes increasingly an intense spiritual change and becomes the radiantly unfolding lotus of the spirit. And as the intensity of its seeking is beyond the highest power of the normal human emotions, so also the delight and the final ecstasy are beyond the reach of the imagination and beyond the expression by speech. For this is the delight of the Godhead that passes human understanding. Indian bhakti has given to the divine love powerful forms, poetic symbols which are not in reality so much symbols as intimate expressions of truth, which can find no other expression. It uses human relations and sees a divine person not as mere figures, but because there are divine relations of supreme delight and beauty, with the human soul of which human relations are the imperfect but still the real type, and because that delight and beauty are not abstractions or qualities of a quite impalpable metaphysical entity, but the very body and form of the Supreme Being. It is a living soul to which the soul of the Bhakta yearns, for the source of all life is not an idea or a conception or a state of existence, but a real being. Therefore, in the possession of the divine beloved, all the life of the soul is satisfied, and all the relations by which it finds and in which it expresses itself are wholly fulfilled. Therefore, too, by any and all of them can the beloved be sought, though those which admit the greatest intensity are always those by which he can be most intensely pursued and possessed with the profoundest ecstasy. He is sought within the heart, and therefore apart from all by an inward gathered concentration of the being and the soul itself, but he is also seen and loved everywhere, where he manifests his being. All the beauty and joy of existence is seen as his joy and beauty. He is embraced by the Spirit in all beings. The ecstasy of love enjoyed pours itself out in a universal love. All existence becomes a radiation of its delight, and even in its very appearances is transformed into something other than its outward appearance. The world itself is experienced as a play of the divine delight, a lila, and that in which the world loses itself is the heaven of beatitude of the eternal union.